Are veterans in priority need? Now, as with any question within the Housing Act, it's never straightforward, and part of the reason for this, before we even get into it, is that priority need means something very specific within the Housing Act 1996. If you want to get fancy about it, it all comes back to Part 7, which is the homeless application process. But Part 6 of the Housing Act is also going to be interesting to you if you are in some sort of housing need, because Part 6 governs the way that councils have to apply a policy to their housing registers to work out who can get on it and how much priority you get if you're on it. Veterans are taught specifically within a lot of housing allocation schemes, that housing register policy, Part 6, and many councils are signed up to the Armed Forces Covenant, which essentially means they're going to get some kind of preferential treatment over other people on the register in some way. So it might be they get an additional band, or they might get extra points or whatever, and so they would hopefully get housed faster. Now, priority need means something very specific within Part 7, and it only comes in Part 7. So as I say, priority is in Part 6 as well, but priority need is only seen in Part 7. And so in Part 7, it basically says that someone could be in priority need through a list of things, and one of those things it lists is having served in the British Armed Forces. And I guess the thinking behind this is pretty obvious. Lots of people who serve in the armed forces will suffer harm, whether it's physical or mental, and that would have an impact on their ability to deal with the consequences of homelessness if they were to subsequently become homeless. So the short answer to get to this point is not automatically. You've got to often look at other things going on in that person's life. And probably something I'd say from my own experience of working in homelessness is that when I've worked with veterans and got to know them pretty well, and I'd probably say maybe a handful of people I've got to know really well over the years, is actually it's really worth looking at their social history before they went into the forces, because some people absolutely become, they suffer some sort of harm whilst in the forces while serving that renders them vulnerable later on. But in my experience, actually, certainly it's really quite striking. Some of the stories that people have told me is that the armed forces kind of actually looked after them pretty well. It was their experience of life before they went into the forces that was actually the issue. So I remember working with a lady who was, I think, in her 40s, and when she was 12 years old, she'd basically been abandoned by her parents, gone into the care system, as seems to be the default in that era, was abused in that care system. And so going into the armed forces was her ticket out of there when she was 17. And so she got into the forces, she served, I think she'd done numerous tours, ended her service, went into mainstream work, had a family. And when their child approached their 12th birthday, I think a lot of things started unraveling in terms of just the impact that they had on them beforehand. And so they were faced with this kind of like overwhelming kind of psychological issues that were deep rooted from back in their own childhood. And basically in that situation, having got to know her pretty well, I would say it would have been quite difficult to say that she was in priority need because of the time in the forces. But as I say, there was this kind of additional element actually that potentially she went into the forces in the first place because of the difficulty she was suffering from, and they had a very long-standing issue. So she was presenting in her 40s, attempting to take her own life, and kind of in a very difficult place. So that's one thing to say. Another thing to kind of say with this is that, as with a lot of these different subtypes of vulnerability, the way you actually evidence it in the real world is through a psychological or a psychiatric diagnosis. So say for example PTSD. So I've never really had to make an argument, or never been able to make an argument, that someone's vulnerable on the basis of their time in the armed forces on its own. It's been because we were able to evidence it because of that harm that was kind of later diagnosed. And so I think in one sense, I don't know that you necessarily need to have a standalone category of veteran in the priority need list. It's not going to do any harm. But as I say, with most of those lists, you're actually looking at whether someone has kind of suffered some kind of harm that's led to a psychiatric issue or physical injury later on in life. That's not to say it's always the case. I mean, I guess you could make the case that someone's institutionalised. Again, if they've gone into the forces at a young age and not kind of had that experience of managing a tenancy and those sorts of things. But I think you're much more likely to see it within psychological issues. And one thing I kind of mentioned earlier, that the list in the 2002 Homelessness Act specifically talked about Her Majesty's Armed Forces back then, His Majesty's Armed Forces. And so it's limited to British people who served in the British forces. However, in that same list, at the bottom it basically says any other special reason. And so in one sense, if you can make an argument that someone's vulnerable because of their time serving in the British forces, you could probably be no different to make an argument that someone's in priority need because of their time serving in the Ukrainian forces or something like that, someone who's come to the country after the war, because it's the same kind of effects that are going to be seen, that are going to be long-standing, that has an impact on that person's ability to deal with homelessness down the line.